The United States and China are not the only nations with ambitions to project power in space. India is also in the running. Now, in recent years, the country has conducted a number of successful scientific missions. But what about its defense capabilities? What advantages do relative newcomers to the space race have over established powers? Share your thoughts on our social media. And now, to discuss how India's breakthrough in global strategies can keep space secure, we welcome Arun Radhakrishnan, a serial space entrepreneur and an international relations expert. And he's also currently the Chief Growth Officer at InspeCity and is joining us from Thrissur city in the South Indian state of Kerala. So, Arun, I just want to start with why space is now a critical frontier for India. They're putting a lot of resource into space technologies.
Thank you, Divya, for having me on the studio. So when we look at the evolution of warfare over the past few decades, we have gone from land, sea, air, and now space is a very strategic domain in this regard. So the current decisions on the warfare, specifically in terms of having the communication networks, in terms of having surveillance, this is all necessitated with the use of satellites. So unless countries are able to invest in satellites and building those space assets, it's going to be a make or break situation in the warfare. So this is prompting countries like India to invest heavily in, satellite-based surveillance and communication.
Right. Now, India's 2019 mission Shakti demonstrated anti-satellite or ASAT capabilities. Can you explain what kind of or how significant that is and how much emphasis India is putting in its anti-satellite capabilities?
So when you look at the number of space assets in the world, there are more than 10,000 satellites. And of which there are about 600 to 700 satellites, which are specifically in the military domain. The rest of this are from commercial satellites. Now, when a country has capability to take or have active deterrence, that is what ASAT specifically is. It is essentially saying that we can take down your space assets in the time of a critical war. So just as how we are sort of blackmailed by the threat of a nuclear bomb, in the event of a war, all rationality is sort of suspended. So when you have this capability for taking down your space assets at any given notice, it sort of makes people think twice about targeting other space assets. And that is what Mission Shakti is. It is sort of a deterrence for India to demonstrate that, look, we are not here to fight, but if our assets are threatened, we have the capability to take out your assets.
Now, one of India's biggest, I wouldn't call it adversaries, but, the other country on the continent, let's say, that India does shape up against is China, which has 450 surveillance satellites and counter space weapons. So how much are China's capabilities being taken into consideration when India draws up its space strategies?
So, as I mentioned before, that China, it is not just the military satellites that are working in China's favor, but they do have a lot of commercial satellites which are also upping the game. If you look at the news recently, the Houthis, for instance, they've been utilizing imagery from private Chinese companies to plan attacks against the US military. And this is a very, serious matter. So in the case of India's space assets, India has a network of satellites, specifically the GSATs and the RISATs, which are used by the armed forces for communication and surveillance. And India is planning to launch about 52 satellites, which are specifically surveillance satellites, of which 31 would be built by the private industry and 21 from ISRO. So India is trying to sort of gain some strategic leverage in terms of matching up to China's orbital assets, but space remains more than just a game of having military satellites. It also draws up to how you can have private companies also come into the picture and contribute towards creating that capability.
Now, in the current India-Pakistan tensions we're seeing right now, how much is India's space capabilities or satellite technology being used for India to have some kind of an upper hand there?
So let me quote the chairman of ISRO, who had come out on the media to say that we have about 10 satellites that are being utilized for Operation Sindoor. And there's also a lot of requests which have been put out on the international forum for imagery from, again, private consortiums in the US and in Japan specifically. And it's interesting to note that it is not just the Indian military which is utilizing space assets, but the enemy, for instance, for the planning of the attacks, they had utilized imagery from Maxar, which was out in the media this week in India. And a lot of eyebrows are being raised about how this imagery is so freely available to anybody that, I believe that a hard line has to be drawn in terms of how do we, utilize these assets for the, for the good or for the bad in some way. Some regulation needs to be brought in.
Now, if a hard line isn't drawn, and it's going to be a very difficult thing to do to draw that hard line and get all the international cooperation, what would space warfare look like for India?
So when we speak about space warfare, the first thing that comes to our mind is, a Star Wars sort of scene where you have satellites with lasers shooting down other satellites in space. But we are already seeing it in the last few years, specifically with the conflicts in Ukraine, where commercial satellites have sort of been taken out with GPS attacks and spoofing and jamming capabilities of the adversary nations. And this has had a spillover effect on commercial transactions. So I imagine that in the future, wars will not just be based on geopolitical leverage. It's not about having the bigger satellite weapon, but it's more about if you can take out the communication networks, you take out the financial grid, you can't land planes, you can't move your ships. It's going to have a spillover effect that's going to affect each and every one of us. I believe it makes it clear that when you sort of supply imagery or communication data, you sort of paint a bullseye on your satellite in terms of other hostile nations, targeting your assets. So imagine the future would more or less be entangled, would be an entanglement in some way between the military players and the commercial players.
All right, what a fantastic answer, and that brings up so many other questions. Unfortunately, we don't have that much time, so I want to bring it to Taiwan, Arun. Now, Taiwan, as we know, is a technological powerhouse in the Indo-Pacific. It's heavily reliant on space-based systems. Now, you talked about the idea of it doesn't necessarily have to be the more powerful nation if you use this kind of technology. So in that sense, how vulnerable is Taiwan when it comes to space-based threats, especially from China?
So Taiwan has about 42 companies, I'm currently aware, that is contributing to the global satellite supply chain. And what is interesting is that since the Space Development Act in 21, I believe it was 21, which has sort of enforced private companies to sort of be a participant in the space race, you are seeing the how do I say this, emphasis on costs versus security, because much of the private consortiums, when they manufacture these components, it's about getting the most cost-effective, faster components to send these chop up to space. And when you look at the traditional paradigm where satellites were more resilient to cyber attacks, more resilient towards any sort of damage, I believe that actually makes the entire industry vulnerable because it is going to be much more because the standards are not there yet in terms of having satellites which are more resilient to these threats. So even in terms of hijacking the supply chain, in terms of taking away some of the companies which can again have rogue components sort of come in, it's very hard to track this in the space domain. So Taiwan needs to keep a very close eye And one thing that I would like to point is the reliance again on other companies to sort of help for allies. Because when you look at the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Starlink, for instance, was sort of operationalized for military purposes. And if Taiwan were to lead with foreign players in terms of participation, it also needs to be looked at as to how much foreign companies can help in this regard. So Taiwan specifically must invest in domestic capabilities, and there should be a handholding from the government to sort of tell the private companies what these standards are, how can we make our space assets more robust, and protocols to be
one of the key phrases you've said is the idea of cooperation, and at the moment you're saying it more between commercial interests. But how about country to country cooperation? Are we seeing, or could Taiwan leverage India's advances for its security, or for its protection, or for it to be able to continue to build despite threats from its neighbor?
So Taiwan being a strategic powerhouse in some way in the Pacific Ocean, I think that makes its position much more interesting. So you are seeing that the Quad group of nations, for instance, they have been forming working groups in space, where the government has been putting out their list of expectations and requirements, and the private consortium sort of, forming public-private partnerships. In the same manner, I believe that such level of, data sharing, joint exercises in space are things which Taiwan could participate and conceptualize with the rest of the nations that sort of form the Indo-Pacific corridor. And in some way, Taiwan could be like first line of defense. Because again, in terms of a defensive posture, you need to proactively monitor threats and retaliate. And Taiwan being the closest outboard towards the Chinese side, I wouldn't want to say it, would actually give some sort of leverage for the other participating nations to be a part of this framework.
How important do you think space will be in future warfare? Share your thoughts in the comments section below. Click the video beside me for a discussion on the growing strategic importance of outer space. And if you don't want to miss future stories on tech and business from Connected, hit the subscribe button and toggle the notification bell.